afternoon and welcome to the 514th in our series of Distinguished Speaker programs. I am Cindy O'Connell. I'm privileged to be your club president and welcome. And now it's my great pleasure to ask Mr. Watkins to come forward to introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Good afternoon, everyone. Which ones of these is working? There we go. So, medical marijuana. I first wanted to sort of introduce the subject, provide background and an overview. So, first, and in sort of preparing for this, learned a couple of acronyms along the way. Medical marijuana was first authorized in Florida, I don't know, four years ago or something like that. It was what they call low THC, so for medical treatment for people with epilepsy and other conditions. And then it evolved. We had a constitutional amendment that passed by 71% in 2016, which took effect January 1st of 2017. So we've been at this about 2.5 years now, I think, Courtney. She's our substantive expert over here. She'll call me out if I get this wrong. But so now it's evolved into medical marijuana, and the latest debate was about smokable versus not smokable, but it's all about implementing the constitutional amendment with medical marijuana. So there's two different varieties. One's low THC and the other is regular stuff for medical purposes. But it's been a phenom across the country, as you guys well know, and a lot of different states have different regulatory regimes and different legal requirements, and the federal government had stepped away under the prior administration, and then Jeff Sessions did a memo that said, wait a minute, it's against federal law, and that sort of froze everything temporarily. And so it's a big deal across the country. And so we're fortunate enough today, just some fun facts to know and tell, and I can't wait to hear what Andrew has to say. I had no preview, but we've got the nation's substantive expert, who is the Cannabis Czar from Colorado, which is kind of where all this started in one way, shape, or form. To hear what he has to say about this remarkable phenomenon and what it might mean for the state and what it looks like, both economically and socially, in terms of how this rolls out. So just a couple of fun facts. Qualified patients, there's now 222,000 card-carrying cannabis patients in the state. There are 2,277 physicians who are licensed to prescribe medical marijuana. There are one of our homegrown companies, True Leaf, has 29 dispensaries throughout the state. They're number one, followed by Curaleaf with 24, and then Sutera Wellness with 3, and then the list goes on. So you can see, us here in Tallahassee, we kind of live in a bit of a bubble, but it's in other parts of the state, it is expanding exponentially. So there are 126 total dispensaries in the state. So Andrew, like I said, Cannabis Czar of Colorado. I think you need to start with his CV, his educational background, to understand how he's sort of uniquely positioned to deal with this issue from a regulatory perspective. He has a philosophy degree from Tufts and then a law degree from Harvard. And we won't hold the law degree against him because he's found his way out of that and into helping the society. But so he was instrumental in developing the operating model for cannabis regulation in Colorado, which really sort of set the standard and the framework for everyone who comes after. Brookings Institute has recognized him as in his success in Colorado for legalization. He's done a remarkable job in creating the regulatory framework. He's been recognized working for the governor in Colorado. You see in Echo there all of the different media outlets that he's consulted with. everything from 60 Minutes to the NBC Nightly News, the Today Show, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. It just goes on and on and on. So he's been named the men's, he's influenced healthcare in a way that is very unique. One of the recognized as the top 30 influencers of health care in the United States, the 100 most creative people in business. And without further ado, I'm just taking time, dribbling on. Andrew, would you talk to us about cannabis?
Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody. Ben, thank you. That was by far one of the most elocucious introductions I've ever received, so thank you. I do want to take 2 minutes, first of all, to thank Cindy, I've known her for about 3 minutes, and I think she's one of my best friends, and so, and quickly, just so you guys know, this room right now has the greatest concentration of cannabis knowledge in the country, and so it's one of these things where we probably shouldn't have us all together in one place. Not only Mike sitting next to me, but Christian Bax in the back there is the first one who actually brought me to Florida. He was the original, the OG cannabis czar here, and Courtney Coppola is the current cannabis czar here. And honestly, these people care about getting it right. They care about public health. They care about public safety. They care about making this a legitimate system. And so you're in great hands here, and most of all because they reach out to me and pay me money to come in every once in a while and help them. So I really believe a lot in them. No, honestly. So. I am the world's first cannabis czar. I do tell people when I graduated from law school, my mom was very proud, and she told everybody at the parties that I was a Harvard lawyer. And then when I became the world's first cannabis czar, she told everybody that I was a Harvard lawyer. And so it's a culture shift for everyone, not just Tallahassee to the rest of the state, but also Jewish moms across the country. My mission throughout it, I came about this, if you can, honestly. I was agnostic towards the legalization of cannabis. I actually had very little to do with the debate when the voters passed it in 2012 in Colorado. I was working for the governor, I was working for the lieutenant governor as chief of staff, and the governor approached me and said, this has become kind of such an issue, we need somebody agnostic to come in and essentially be a nerdy technocrat to see it through. And so that was my start in cannabis. And since then, for the last 6 years, I've made my life about how to implement this in a way that meets the voters' wills, but also meets public health and public safety standards, and is done, frankly, the best way possible. And so that has taken various forms. At the beginning, obviously, 3 years as cannabis czar in Colorado, but then later on, I launched a consulting firm called Freedman and which is myself and a chief regulator who are working mainly directly for governments. We've now worked for 17 governments, again, helping them implement legalization. Because of that role, we don't directly ever take cannabis money, so we've never taken money from the industry. We have taken money from ancillary businesses. And what you're here today, this is actually a very special speech for me. This is the first time I'm going to, you have a brand new speech from here because we're actually in the third phase of how we're thinking about this, which is we're pre-launch of an investment fund right now called Caldwell Capital. I would say Caldwell, that is, Samuel Caldwell was the first person ever arrested for marijuana possession in the United States, about 2 blocks from where my office for Cannabis Czar was. But also last night, you guys were all nice enough to put me up at the Governor Caldwell suite in Governor's Inn. So maybe it's also about that. So there's essentially 2 parts. I'm gonna give you kind of the Cliff Notes version of the speech I would normally give maybe to like a public health or public safety convention about what we've learned from Colorado. And then I'll go into kind of the title of the speech, which is kind of what everybody is getting wrong about the green rush and really where the investment opportunities is, or at least where my thesis of where the investment opportunities will be. But I think for both issues, kind of if you're interested as an investor, if you're interested as a citizen, if you're interested as government, your first question should always be, what is success? How will legalization be graded? And Because if it goes poorly, you can be in the industry, your market's not going to expand, right? This is still at the will of the voters. This is still an experiment in very many ways. If it goes poorly as the government, that's directly on you. And then even as an investment, I think both for sleeping well at night, but also for the sake of the long-term investment, you need to make sure that it is success. And so the first thing I think is always important is to define what success looks like here. Both from polls and also from my general feelings on the situation, the first bucket I would put that in is public health. And that's a general question of how does everybody react when cannabis is legal? And how is that different than from when it's illegal? And the questions we normally get in there are things like, what happens to youth use? That's honestly always the first question that we get. And the second one is, what happens to the adult population? Are people showing up in hospitals? Are those who are more likely to be addicted using more? What's the effect on substance abuse? That's really the public health bucket that I think is the primary place where we should be created here. The second place, and almost as important, is again also public safety. And this question is, this was passed on a promise, especially the adult use world, less so the medical world, but passed on the promise that it was safer to not be throwing people in prison, but instead to give public health responses to these problems. And that legalization ultimately would save money in the public safety system and ultimately be a more safe system. So to what extent is that true? And how can we see the costs of public safety? And then the third one, which is oftentimes people's first one, is the economics of it. From the government point of view, has this been a boon for taxes? And from the private side, has it been a boon for the economy? Part of that conversation as well is, who's it been a boon for? That's a conversation I don't think we have quite enough time to handle today, but is probably one of the hottest topics right now, which is there was a belief that this could be a boon for the communities most impacted by the war on drugs, and for the most part, that has not come true, which is even in systems that are trying very hard for that to become true. Oakland has some systems for equity economic development. So far, we have not seen that come through. It's a topic I would love to talk a lot about. I think it deserves a full hour on its own. But those are the stages of grading that we're seeing here. So I'll start with the Colorado experiment. Colorado legalized just 7 years ago at this point, which is a long timeline. So public health data normally takes 10 years to really see what's going on, but it's enough time to be able to see what are some immediate impacts that we've seen post-legalization when you go fully legal like Colorado has gone. So the first one, again, that we always get is youth use and legalization. And again, I'm going to be giving the cliff notes on this. I'm not giving this data enough justice, but in an attempt to also talk about the investment side, I'm going to be running through these. You might not be able to see all of this, but this is kind of the graph that people point to on both sides on what happened to youth use. And so the way this happens is there is an anonymous survey that's put out for kids 12 to 17 years old by the federal government that says, have you used marijuana in any way over the last 30 days? And this is the Colorado data. So a few things to point out. First of all, amongst all age groups, Colorado enjoys marijuana. More so than the national average. We're the blue on top. That has been true for the last 20 years. It remains true today. I think of interest to us is you can see the bump in 2013, 2014 up, and then it moving down afterwards. 2013, 2014 was the year commercialization started in Colorado. And then obviously the years preceding. And so you will hear many different you will hear many different people tell you what happened to youth use post-legalization. They're all referring to this chart. So the advocates for it will say that there was essentially a 20% reduction in youth use post-legalization, and opponents will say immediately following legalization there was essentially a 20% increase. They are all talking about the same bump that you see in there. What most public health officials would tell you in Colorado is nothing in there is really all that statistically significant. And so it's probably not good to draw any particular conclusions from that. I will say also some ways in which this data is lacking is it's not asking how much people are smoking. And so one of the things that we have done wrong as a public health community is essentially we long ago just decided that it was bad if you smoke marijuana, so all we need to know is, do you smoke marijuana? Well, probably by far the more important decision is marijuana having a negative impact on your life? Are you a substance abuser? Are you not showing up to school because of it? Are you having trouble holding down a job? There are really no public health surveys on the federal level that really track that data over time. And so that has been probably one of the biggest weaknesses in the use of data. And so across all age groups, what you'll see in Colorado is generally the same trend line that you saw before legalization. For the most part, there's been slight increases across different age groups. Actually, the only one with really statistically significant increase is 65 and older. Probably people who were using it for pain relief purposes and didn't want to go to a doctor to talk about it. But for the most part, there's been gradual increase across every other sector, but not in a different, not any faster than it was increasing before. What we don't know is really what's happening to people who are addicted or can become substance abuse users. The more acute thing that we did see post-legalization is an increase in poison control center calls. I think this is particularly useful data, more so than hospitalization rates, more so than driving while high data. You have to opt into the system. You are deciding as an individual that you're going to call the poison control center, so observation data is less of a problem, observation bias is less of a problem. People who are calling in have a problem. And what you did see is an increase in poison control center calls post-legalization. You're actually seeing this across the country. It is mainly, if we dig down into the data, naive users using new products. And the most common is to think about a tourist using an edible. It's the same story every time, and so you can tell all of your friends about this if they do want to travel to one of these states. They have one edible. They rate about an hour, even though the person who sold it to them told them to wait 3 to 4 hours. They wait about an hour. They think they got a dud for some reason. They have a second edible. They wait another hour. They figure, oh, I don't react to marijuana, and they start drinking. And then they have essentially what is a psychotic break. And so the good news is that all you do is wait it out, and there's no long-term effect to that. The bad news is you're a danger to yourself and you're a danger to the people around you. And so don't get in a car and drive. Don't be near tall places. There's a lot of things that can go wrong when you are on a miniature psychotic break. But the most important one is take one edible with one dose, which is 10 milligrams or 5 milligrams. I would really say 5 milligrams. Wait for the entire night. Don't have anything else. That is your night. Unfortunately, that is not what people do. Now, I will say, to bring this into relation, that at the peak there, we have 230 total incidents in Colorado. That same year for alcohol, it was 6,500 calls to the Poison Control Center call. So I always try to say that graph, when it looks just like that, it looks enormous. When you look at it compared to other public health consequences, it really is quite minor. This is another graph, although I do believe this is probably the scariest of all the graphs. This is the fatal accident reporting system. This is essentially when somebody's in a fatal accident, they have a toxicology report done on them, whether they are living or dead. And we have seen an increase in people involved in fatal accidents that are testing positive for cannabis in some way or another. Now, there's a lot of different ways to interpret this. You could say, well, maybe prevalence has gone up and it's just in your system in some ways, although we also test for active THC, which means you've used in the last 3 to 4 hours. That has also gone up as a percentage. And so I do believe that people do think it's okay to drive while high. They think it's okay because they drive slower, and what they don't realize is when you drive slower, you are a danger to yourself and you're a danger to everybody else. And so I do think that driving while high is probably one of the most significant acute issues with cannabis legalization, and it's a place where a lot of public education campaign money should come in. Now, I will tell you, there's been an increase in people testing positive for THC in in fatal accidents. However, Colorado remains below the national average or above the national average for safety. We are slightly safer than the rest of the country to drive in. And so it does not move the top line figure to a significant amount when you look at it that way, that essentially, again, driving while drunk is a much bigger deal, driving while texting is a much bigger deal, driving while distracted in general is a much bigger deal. And so it's not that the sky has fallen and that you shouldn't drive while you're in Colorado, you're still probably safer there, but that this is an ongoing issue of legalization. Tax revenue has been awesome for Colorado. It has been, we do roughly about $250 million a year in tax revenue. I say that, and then I pause and I say, out of a $36 billion budget. So we're dealing with less than 1% of the total Colorado budget. Again, and in addition, when people do economic impact, depending on the multiplication that you put to the economic multiplier you put on it, it's somewhere between 1-2% of GDP. And so that is a significant sector, but it is not running Colorado's tax system. We do not pay for education. We do not make up for education or for transportation or for healthcare. Things that deal with billions of dollars in tax revenue is not handled by what's ultimately called a sin tax. And you can't see that with casinos, you can't see that with tobacco, you can't say that with alcohol, and you certainly can't say that with marijuana. And so while it is a very significant amount of revenue, and can go to a lot of really good programs, I always say don't pass this because you think you can solve your state's budget issues. It is not that sort of money. Okay, so that is so much shorter than I normally give all of that because the title of today is what everybody's getting wrong with the green rush, and I do want to talk about that. So where is the green rush? And I will say, I think probably the deal is that the green rush meant to be modeled after the gold rush is probably the wrong analogy, and most definitely the wrong analogy. In the end of the day, cannabis is an agricultural commodity where marginal revenue will equal marginal cost over the long term. And so when you had a gold mine and you were finding gold, gold was worth a lot of money, and you might have spent less finding that gold than you will get selling that gold at the end of the day. There's a little bit of luck in that, but there was certainly this opening opportunity that was fairly large. Those are limited in the cannabis system, and I'll talk about why they still exist in some places, but ultimately it's much better to look at this as a crop and dealing with it as a crop under very specific regulations that do cause some profit margins and some losses in other places, but that ultimately if this were allowed to be completely legal, the profit would almost completely go away right away off the growing and selling of cannabis, and you really end up seeing people who could go to large scales as quickly as possible. Your big ag, big tobacco, big alcohol people of the world would be kind of the only winners directly within the system if this were interstate commerce were allowed, if people were allowed to grow kind of as large grows as they wanted to, if licensing wasn't an issue. So the challenge here is how to turn an agricultural commodity into consistent long-term profits, knowing that this is a forever changing landscape. And so the thesis we've been working on is kind of twofold within Caldwell Capital. First, in cannabis, the rules will determine who profits. So more than any other market at this point, government rules kind of determine the entire chessboard of where you're going. And so I put up a picture of California and a picture of Florida there. There are massively different regulatory systems there. On the California level, in theory, you can get as many people as want to can get a state license in California. In Florida, we're dealing with, I want to say 20 now, 22 total licenses for the entire state. Only medical in Florida, but 220 million patients. Last time I looked, somewhere like a $4 billion, $5 billion market. That is a very limited license opportunity. California might be a huge state with somewhere between 13 million that can come in from it, but when you have thousands and thousands of entrants, then it is kind of less of a license opportunity there. So what you've seen in California is a lot of people balk at even entering the license system for a number of reasons. One is they actually like to export out of state and not keep it in state, and that is not something that they let you do as a licensee. but also because it's costly to get a license, and it's difficult to meet the regulatory structure, and it hasn't proven yet to be economically advantageous to do so. Meanwhile, in Florida, you guys actually have some of the most profitable licenses in the world right now with your limited license system. People have different feelings about that, by the way. If you have one of those licenses, that's probably pretty cool for you. If you don't, there are some negative implications both for access to the market, but also for public health and public safety. There are some challenges with getting enough competition going to really make sure that you're getting the best of the industry. That's probably a conversation for a different day. However, if you're purely looking at it from an investment standpoint, having a limited license system like Florida is clearly going to be a much more advantageous system than California, and it's one of the numerous ways you can see that the rules of the game that are being written right now at the state and federal levels is almost completely predicting whether or not you're in a profitable market or not. So the second part of this thesis then is that it pays more to build the system than to operate inside it. On the left is a picture of the gold rush, and on the right is a picture of the green rush, and this is the picks and shovels argument, right? So the people on the left are all wearing Levi's jeans, all have a certain brand of gun, all have a certain brand of hat. That ended up to be the long-term profit within gold rush, right? If you look at where people still have financial wealth today, it's Levi Strauss. It's the people who have decided what is it that every worker needed in the system in order to operate, how do we build around that, and how does that ancillary service continue to hold profit down the road. There are numerous opportunities like that in cannabis right now, and so this is a regulated cannabis grow. I'm going to go through a couple of verticals that I think are essentially what will be required to build the system, the regulatory system, and then I'm going to give examples of companies that operate in there. So my favorite one is regulatory technology. So if you look on those plants, you see some tags if you can squint, but here's a better picture of it. This is a Florida-based company called Metric. So in a market this new, government needs new infrastructure. This is what we call regulatory technology, or reg tech, if you want to be awesome and cool. What reg tech is essentially, so here's a problem with cannabis, which is if you're growing in California, a pound of marijuana is worth about $800 on the wholesale market in California. You move that out to an illicit state, it can be worth up to $3,000. And so if you are a regulator, you are incredibly worried that your regulated community wants to push this, that we call it diversion, wants to divert this cannabis out of the system, which is actually unique to cannabis compared to any other regulated product. Most of the time, there's very little economic incentive to push it out of the regulated system unless you're just a worker who wants to make a quick buck on the side, or you have extreme tax revenue differences between states. There's not really a ton of reason to ship it out of the regulated system. And moreover, cannabis is valuable from essentially day one, really about week 3, but from the very beginning of inventory, it is a valuable product because it can be moved out and continue to grow and can flower. It's more valuable as flower, but it has to be tracked the entire way. Alcohol is not a valuable product right until the end when it's turned into whatever mixture it's going to be turned into. And so cannabis regulators have this unique challenge of having to track everything from what we call seed to sale. It's really clone to sale, but seed to sale. So this group, Metric, first people in the country to say, well, why don't we put little radio frequency identifier tags on every single plant? And essentially a regulator can walk in and just wave a wand and say, oh, you're supposed to have 500 plants here, and you have 500 plants here. And in that way, it can track and make sure that you have pushed it out of the system. And then every state came by and said, yes, we do want an inventory control system. And so we will put out one bid that will oversee all cannabis plants in our state. And so California's done this, Colorado's done this, and of all of the states that have done it, Metric's won 80% of the contracts because they were one of the first people in doing that. And And so they now their tag, it's sold at 30 cents, 50 cents a piece, are on every single plant in 80% of the system. So not only do they have that, there's also unbelievably valuable data that is coming from that, and an example of how getting in early on regulatory technology can be a consistent profit maker over time. And especially government contracts are very sticky. You train your government employees on how to use something. Moving away from that is very costly for government. Industry becomes reliant on one form of tracking system and also is hesitant to move away from it. An ecosystem of technologies form around the regulatory technology. So there's a lot of reasons once regulatory technology is in there that it becomes sticky, and over time you see it just continue to gain profit margins. So it is a vertical in this world that is probably underutilized, underthought about in the venture capital world, but extremely valuable. So here, that was my favorite one, is RegTech, but there are other ways to build the system. I know this is far too small to read, so I'll read them out to you. These are what I would call system building verticals that are emerging right now and will prove to be highly profitable in the long run. The first is quality assurance. So we've talked before about this being an agricultural commodity where the profit margin drops over time to near zero. The difference, the one way you can get out of that is brand differentiation. Being able to prove to people that you will get a more consistent quality experience, that something has been tested for pesticides, or that it does not have a certain form of mold on it, or when you take a dose of this is the feeling that you will get, that this has been tested on 500 people your age and has had this reaction. There's a number of different ways to have quality assurance that will differentiate your brand from other brands and create a product you can charge more money for. What lacks in our system right now is actually the tools for quality assurance. There's a lot of groups interested in this, but I'll give you an example. Right now in the Colorado system, you can call your cannabis anything you want to call your cannabis. And so if you look towards your neighbor, and your neighbor is selling Bubba Kush for more money than they're selling any other genetics, you just change your genetics to Bubba Kush. You just say, okay, my plant is now Bubba Kush. And that's what's showing up at your retail store. And maybe it has a lot to do with the genetics that your neighbor is selling, or maybe it doesn't, but you've called it the same thing. There's no intellectual property right now in the cannabis world. And so you can call it whatever you call it and sell it for a greater amount, and people get wise to that, and they stop relying on the names being given by the companies. But then there's no brand differentiation, and so what you're seeing at the beginning is celebrity branding. People said, well, if we can't do that sort of branding, we will get Bob Marley, we'll get Marley brand, we'll get Snoop Dogg brand, and those have sold at kind of what I would imagine to be more of a novelty rate. But what is lacking in the system right now is really the handshake promise between the consumer and the grower that what you're paying for is actually a difference in quality, and that we know how to scale that and bring that across. And so, for instance, there's a company very interested in rapid DNA right now who wants to be kind of at the point of distribution, being able to link back to your mother plant and being able to show, yes, when this has a certified stamp on it, when it reaches the consumer, it actually is the genetics that is being promised to it. And my guess is that company's going to do fairly well in this world. The next thing to talk about is just, this is a broad category, but I don't mean it to be so broad, is tech. That essentially companies, there are a number of platforms that are needed right now. Point of sale platforms, platforms that talk to your bank called fintech. There are platforms needed for how to have a cannabis exchange and be able to run all cannabis through a central wholesaler. All of those things, there are a number of companies right now competing to be the platform for how those things operate. What's interesting about that is that sort of tech, these sort of business-to-business and business-to-customer platforms of technology, software, they will do better the better they can communicate both with quality assurance programs and with regulatory technology. And so now you're starting to see an ecosystem form of groups that, if together, that if they work together actually have an unfair advantage over other people in the industry and are more likely to be successful over time. And so if your point of sale system talks to the inventory control system and also talks to the rapid DNA system such that you can know for certain that this is what's being sold at this point at this time and it's being sold at this profit margin, that's information then you can communicate directly to your business or you can hold it central and say this is a report you can charge us money, we can charge you money for. There just becomes a number of different ways that regulatory technology, quality assurance, and technology can all interact together and become highly profitable. The fourth one I want to talk to on the bottom right there is infrastructure. Infrastructure is difficult here, and I think very hard about this because there's a number of things that the actual picks and shovels that used to be profitable in the old markets that are less profitable now. And so it used to be essentially if you were growing marijuana, you fit in what was called the hobbyist part of the market because you couldn't go to a central distributor and get your agricultural products. So you had to go to a small store, get your growing medium from there, and bring it to a basement and grow it in the basement. Well, now we have giant warehouses. And so maybe the product you were buying in that in the hobbyist location no longer works for giant warehouses. Or maybe now outdoor grows are proving to be a better way of growing in your state, in which case you used to grow in cocoa beans and now it's soil. All of those are very important changes in the market. But ultimately what you're looking for if you're talking about infrastructure and you're interested in infrastructure play is what are parts of infrastructure that don't react to economies of scale. Meaning, what are volume-based infrastructures? Soil is a good one. Growing mediums is a good one to think about. So, for instance, there's a company called Groden. Groden makes a sort of wool rock that has proven to be very popular for indoor grows. And what you're essentially seeing from them is they used to do indoor tomatoes. Now they're doing a huge market in cannabis because it is a very good way of growing indoors. And there's only one plant per a block. And that will continue to be the case through the future. So even if we do get massive grows with massive economies of scale, there's still just one block per one plant. And so their profit margins continue to go up over time because they can continue to sell in greater and greater bulks without having to worry about fewer products being needed and economies of scale being reached. And so those are the sort of infrastructure opportunities to be looking for in the investment arena. Finally, limited licensing systems. Again, from a public health, public safety point of view, you might have different feelings about this, but certainly from an investment point of view, limited licensing is a defensible moat. People who can get in, particularly with retail licenses, early on in a limited licensing system are continuing to show profits in that area. I'll give you a good example, the city of Stockton. There were 3 licensees on the retail side that were in early, and they've done a very good job of just saying, that's it for our city. We will not be seeing any more retail licenses, and from that you really do see a very slow growth in retail license systems. I do say, on the growing side, you're probably taking more risk there. Certainly in a place like Florida, there is a good economic outlook if you are one of the few growers of cannabis. But from a national perspective, if you do think about federal legalization and interstate commerce, you will see a massive consolidation of grows. Even if you're in a limited license state, the probability of it moving to one state is pretty high. That's what we saw with tobacco. That's what we've seen with a number of agricultural commodities, is there's just to back that up. So the purchasers are pretty price sensitive right now, and almost all changes to the system you can see a direct relation for people leaving one market going into a different market based on small differences in price. And so I believe that consumers are not all that sticky when it comes to product choice. I might be proven wrong, or maybe an education about that down the road will change that. But what that means is that, sure, I think there are new consumers that will come into the market. I'm just not sure they'll buy different products. That might not make as big of a difference in brand differentiation as it does certainly in the wine industry.
question is this: have any states done any testing about reaction times in an automobile when someone's at certain levels of intoxication? I've been told by my friends that it tremendously slows down the reactions. And this is long-term experience.
Yeah. So there are a number of studies in this area, what you will see is, yes, there are a number of studies that show that you have a slower reaction time. There are also a few studies that show that you make it through an obstacle course better while high. And so the problem is you'll see a lot of people picking and choosing their friends when it comes to which studies to go with right now. It is unfortunately a very understudied area. My guess is that what you're actually looking at is people go very slow down. They match their reaction time to the speed that they're going down the place, and so maybe they're reacting slower, but they're just not going as fast to their obstacles. Yeah.
You read a lot of the press about the banking situation. This is all cash, and there's dangers associated with that. What's it going to take in order to get federal regulation? Talk a little bit about that.
Yep. So the banking problem is real. Essentially, bankers are looked after by federal regulatory agencies, and this remains money laundering to do business with a marijuana-related bank. There was some guidance put out in February of 2014 from one of these regulatory agencies that said, don't do it at your own risk, but if you are going to do it, here's 3 levels of suspicious activity reporting that you have to do in order to do it. And most banks took a look at that and said, no, thank you. And a few in every state community banks and credit unions said, we could use this sort of merchant service. These people are willing to pay a higher amount to have a bank account. And they, over time, picked up marijuana-related businesses and did the suspicious activity reporting, such that you see a good amount of cannabis industry actually having banking relationships. That's more so in, say, Colorado. Florida went through, I believe,
one bank.
Yeah, Florida really got sensitive when the Sessions memo came out, and there was a number of banks very interested in it that suddenly pulled back at that point.
The feds told us.
Yeah.
Put it at your own risk.
I believe there was a U.S. attorney involved. There was a lot of rumors going around, particularly about Florida, that the prosecution just looked even just a degree higher likely than other places, and everybody pulled back. So merchant services in particular in Florida is a problem. The question was, what's it going to take on a federal level? I'm going to say 2 to 3 years probably before something like the Safe Banking Bill, which is out there, gets passed. Even then, there's still a lot of risk to banking it because there's just a lot of other illegal activities that marijuana-related banks could be in, or marijuana-related businesses could be involved in that you could be held liable for. And so it is going to just be a little bit more expensive to have a bank account even after something like the Safe Banking Act passes. From what I read, the tea leaves right now, it's not passing this year. I think the chair of the Senate committee probably will not let it see the light of day. But it is, I think, probably the first thing you'll see passed on the national level, mainly because it is just quite simply a public safety issue. The other problem with it too is like one of the best ways to look after a regulated business is to look at its bank account, right? And to like know how to do the due diligence, which bankers know better than regulators, that they aren't money laundering or hiding large amounts of cash. And we are doing kind of with our arm tied behind our back, right? Al Capone really got powerful off money laundering. And so it's a shame that we don't have that tool, and it is something that I do think the federal government will fix.
Well, Andrew, that was wonderful. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to give you our Bronze Eagle limited statue made by nationally recognized Stanley Proctor on behalf of your long voyage to see us today and all the information that we learned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The best place in the country to grow it, or maybe internationally to grow it, and you're not seeing that many grows outside of that system. So I'll end with what companies do I think will win over the long term. The first thing I would say is there's a lot to say about second movers right now. There's some first movers in the system that are doing quite well, but a lot of first movers had to do things at the beginning that second movers don't have to do. First of all, they've built infrastructure where it's not optimal to build infrastructure, and they've taken on capital deals when capital was more scarce, and so they've built in a capital structure, a cap table that is not very advantageous and won't scale that well over time. And so you've actually seen a lot of first movers in a lot of a lot of the states that have been here for a while having to move out of the system and essentially just selling out to second movers who come in under much more preferable circumstances. The second thing you want to see is regulatory resilience. You want to see companies that win under multiple scenarios. This thing is changing about as fast as any industry can possibly change. Most of it hangs on, as you heard from before, on a few memos written by attorney generals that you can wake up tomorrow and they could be rescinded. Moreover, who knows where federal legalization is going over time. And so you have enough that can change on your city, county, state, federal level on the regulatory system, that if your system is built on one model and is even say like, hey, our burn is this fast, we need this to be rolled out within the next year, your business idea probably isn't resilient enough to make it in such a regulatory model. And the third place, we didn't talk about this much, is you probably want to be looking at groups that are lucrative customers. The government is, I hate to say this, a lucrative customer over time, particularly because of that stickiness and the inability to really change systems. And the main users of cannabis are lucrative. We see a lot of people right now pitching how to get new people interested in cannabis. You often hear cannabis is the new Chardonnay. What you see with that is not that that's not untrue, that there are new people interested in it, but be careful about that, right? Because it can often cost a lot of money to get a new person into the market, and then that person smokes half a joint a week. That's great from a public health standpoint, that you're like, okay, that's probably a new user, we don't have to worry about that much. But from an economics point of view, you probably are looking at a losing proposition of convincing people to come into the market. And so that is our original brainchild of Caldwell Capital, which is again pre-launch, and this is my introductory speech on it. And so as you have thoughts, I would welcome to hear about them, but I'm also happy to answer questions simply about the state of public health and public safety with legalized cannabis. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. We'll entertain questions from members. I think we're getting set up real quick.
I'm a little confused about all these CBD topical products that supposedly do not contain any THC. Last week, I met some lady who bought CBD lotion, something for her joint pain, and CBD shampoo. She was so excited about it. Do I have a CBD shampoo, and do you want to make any comments about the advantage, and they bought it off in Colorado?
Okay, that makes sense. So let's talk about CBD for a second. It is an extremely complicated regulatory landscape for CBD. In the Farm Bill last year, hemp was legalized on the growing level, and so hemp can produce massive amounts of CBD if grown correctly, with very low amounts of THC, 0.3% per volume of THC or less. And then you, at some point, should be able to turn that into products that maybe have minuscule amounts of THC or maybe have no amounts of THC. That is yet to be determined. However, all of that is still technically illegal under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. And so this is a giant, it's not even a gray area, it's actually just illegal, but we'll say it's a gray area because of enforcement. Nobody wants to come in and say, we're going to shut this all down overnight. A few people tried, and then the backlash from the public was so great that it was difficult to get through. And so the only legal product you can buy right now, or get access to right now, that is CBD is called Epidiolex, which is for intractable epilepsy for infants. And that's been FDA approved, and that's an actual drug that you go and get a prescription for. That being said, there's obviously a number of other therapeutic uses that CBD is used for, and kind of the shame on federal government side is that we've done no FDA-style research on any of that because it's been impossible to do. And so there probably is massive therapeutic benefits to CBD. Determining between who has the actual therapeutic benefits and who is a snake oil salesman is nearly impossible in this system. And moreover, the quality assurance that you are getting a high CBD, low THC product is not really there on a federal level. And so this is a huge buyer beware problem that we are in right now, which is essentially that we don't have the quality assurance systems, and we don't really even have the regulatory framework to properly be selling CBD at this point.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here today. Appreciate the information that you gave us. I have two questions. Number one, we just had a big fight during the past legislative session that just ended recently about children under the age of 18 smoking medical marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
So as a consultant that advises states, what is your advice to states about the health impacts on young brains? Number two, for the employers in this room, where we may employ other people that may be on medical marijuana, regardless of whether we have a drug policy that provides for it or not. What have been the consequences in workers' comp, in automobile insurance, health insurance? I assume that there isn't a lot of data about that, but what do you think that portends for the future?
Sorry, I'm going to have to get a pen for that. You did not go easy on me.
I'm a lobbyist.
All right. You're a lobbyist? All right, then no answer. Okay. Those are the 18 and younger. I have to say, the problem with giving a single answer for that is that there are kids with huge medical problems that are 8 years old, that are in wheelchairs, cannot speak, can barely show up, that are using what I would say is clearly advantageous medical marijuana. I don't know of any argument that it has to be smoked. And so I would have to see clear and convincing evidence that that is an allowance we should make in the short term, and barring better research. The problem with marijuana, unlike any other substance in the United States, is that it operates on innocent until proven guilty rather than guilty until proven innocent. And the reason that is the federal government fault, right? We've done no research on it, and so the populace just got finally upset enough about it that it just said, we're going to go forward with this. It did it both on a state legalization model, but news to everybody, people have been smoking marijuana for a long time, right? In that case, with something like smoking 18 and younger, I would say my tendency would be to go more on the guilty until proven innocent model than innocent until proven guilty, and that you should look for what specifically is it about smoking that makes it advantageous for somebody under the age of 18, and until there's something that can be brought forward to talk about that, stay with no smokables under that. That being said, that's kind of the first time I've ever answered that question, and so that's where I am on that. On the second one, employers. This has become more of a policy issue than an on-the-ground issue. The few times it's come up on the ground, first of all, again, cannabis is kind of new to nobody, right? Like, so you should already have a cannabis, and it should be something like you cannot show up to work intoxicated, right? Cannabis cannot affect either the safety of those around you or your work output. The problem is, as many of you probably know, there actually is no test for intoxication. There's only test for presence. And there's enough kind of evidentiary work you can do to find evidence of intoxication, but it's expensive and it's difficult. Still, all that being said, it's probably the only route forward for employers is really finding that ground. On a legal level, you've seen everything from Colorado says an employer has the right to do whatever they want to do. They can have a drug-free workplace. Doesn't matter if you're on medical or it doesn't matter if you're in adult use. If there's presence of THC in your system, the employer can create employment code to say you're fired upon a random drug screening. Maine or Rhode Island's a good example. Rhode Island has said that that's actually a violation of the Constitution, right? For medical purposes, you cannot fire unless you've proven intoxication. I would say right now, that's probably a choice that Florida has to come to about which side of the aisle it wants to be on that one.
Since I have a background in the wine industry, the statement that you made about cannabis being the new Chardonnay kind of struck a chord with me.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you think the market is already saturated for new consumers for marijuana, and if there is a different way to like market towards them.
So that was totally an anti-Chardonnay comment from me. No, I'm kidding. No, I would say that the market is probably in no way saturated. It is the things that have yet to be proven to me is that the market is actually going to act with a ton of kind of artisan craft. There's a lot of people who fully believe that it will. I have seen no economic data to back that up. So the purchasers are pretty price sensitive right now, and almost all changes to the system you can see a direct relation for people leaving one market going into a different market based on small differences in price. And so I believe that consumers are not all that sticky when it comes to product choice. I might be proven wrong, or maybe an education about that down the road will change that. But what that means is that, sure, I think there are new consumers that will come into the market. I'm just not sure they'll buy different products. That might not make as big of a difference in brand differentiation as it does certainly in the wine industry.
Thank you for coming. My question is this: have any states done any testing about reaction times in an automobile when someone's at certain levels of intoxication? I've been told by my friends that it tremendously slows down the reactions. And this is long-term experience.
Yeah. So there are a number of studies in this area, and what you will see is, yes, there are a number of studies that show that you have a slower reaction time. There are also a few studies that show that you make it through an obstacle course better while high. And so the problem is you'll see a lot of people picking and choosing their friends when it comes to which studies to go with right now. It is unfortunately a very understudied area. My guess is that what you're actually looking at is people go very slow down. They match their reaction time to the speed that they're going down the place, and so maybe they're reacting slower, but they're just not going as fast to their obstacles. Yeah.
You read a lot in the press about the banking situation. This is all cash, and there's dangers associated with that. What's it going to take in order to get federal regulation? Talk a little bit about that.
Yep. So the banking problem is real. Essentially, bankers are looked after by federal regulatory agencies, and this remains money laundering to do business with a marijuana-related bank. There was some guidance put out in February of 2014 from one of these regulatory agencies that said, don't do it at your own risk, but if you are going to do it, here's 3 levels of suspicious activity reporting that you have to do in order to do it. And most banks took a look at that and said, no, thank you. And a few in every state, community banks and credit unions said, we could use this sort of merchant service. These people are willing to pay a higher amount to have a bank account, and then over time picked up marijuana-related businesses and did the suspicious activity reporting, such that you see a good amount of cannabis industry actually having banking relationships. That's more so in, say, Colorado. Florida went through, I believe...
one bank.
Yeah, Florida really got sensitive when the Sessions memo came out, and there was a number of banks very interested in it that suddenly pulled back at that point.
The feds told us.
Yeah.
Put it at your own risk.
I believe there was a U.S. attorney involved. There was a lot of rumors going around, particularly about Florida, that the prosecution just looked even just a degree higher likely than other places, and everybody pulled back. So merchant services in particular in Florida is a problem. The question was, what's it going to take on a federal level? I'm going to say 2 to 3 years probably before something like the safe banking bill, which is out there, gets passed. Even then, there's still a lot of risk to banking it because there's just a lot of other illegal activities that marijuana-related banks could be in, or marijuana-related businesses could be involved in that you could be held liable for. And so it is going to just be a little bit more expensive to have a bank account even after something like the Safe Banking Act passes. From what I read, the tea leaves right now, it's not passing this year. I think the chair of the Senate committee probably will not let it see the light of day. But it is, I think, probably the first thing you'll see passed on the national level, mainly because it is just quite simply a public safety issue. The other problem with it too is like one of the best ways to look after a regulated business is to look at its bank account, right? And to like know how to do the due diligence, which bankers know better than regulators, that they aren't money laundering or hiding large amounts of cash. And we are doing kind of with our arm tied behind our back, right? Al Capone really got powerful off money laundering. And so it's a shame that we don't have that tool, and it is something that I do think the federal government will fix.
Well, Andrew, that was wonderful. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to give you our Bronze Eagle limited statue made by nationally recognized Stanley Proctor on behalf of your long voyage to see us today and all the information that we learned. Thank you.
Thank you so much.